everyone. So nice to see so many people on a Sunday morning. So a lot of, or some familiar faces, but a lot of faces that I personally don't know. So very nice to be here with you all. So our plan for this session is to try and connect the more, let's say, conceptual discussion around degrowth strategy that has been emerging in degrowth over the last years with climate activism. So, and to kind of think how social movements could foster systemic change. So that's our big question, I think, for the session. And we will try to kind of draw both on conceptual discussions and the actual experience and to try and bring them together. So basically, we can start with the introductions. I am Ekatarina Chertkovskaya. It's a very tricky to pronounce surname, so no worries. So, and the name is also not super easy. So Ekaterina and Katya, that's both possible, whichever you prefer. So I'm based at Lund University, and I live in Malmo, and I have been working on degrowth for quite some time now. So since 2014 was a kind of important point for me because I went to the International Degrowth Conference in Leipzig, which was wonderful, convivial, and where a lot of people were there, and it really kind of made me think, okay, this is what I want to be connected to, and this is the community I want to be part of in academia and also in activism. So it felt to me that there is a lot of critique that you're engaged in when you're doing like critical social sciences in academic circles. And then at that point, I was wondering, okay, so how do we move forward in a way where we question the system, but we also try to really push for alternatives that are ecologically sustainable and socially just. And that's how I encountered degrowth, and that's how I met this community. And I'm still, so I'm very happy to be part of that. And in the degrowth discussion, so I would say that all my work I kind of position around degrowth. So, and in this discussion, so I have been part of pushing the discussion around strategies. So knowing that, okay, we know we have a lot of ideas of the problems with the system. We have a lot of ideas of what could be changed and what degrowth kind of looks like. Yeah, is it? Okay. Sorry, I just. Perfect. Yes. So, but the question of how to get there, so the question of strategy is something that we have not been addressing enough. So, yeah, and basically, we see a lot of role in the bottom-up transformations in degrowth circles and a big role for the social movements and climate movement in particular. So I have the pleasure to be in conversation with Fernando Racimo here, who has the first-hand experience of being actually involved in climate activism. So would you like to introduce yourself, Fernando?
Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Fernando. I'm an activist in various groups here in Copenhagen, primarily in Scientist Rebellion, but also involved in other movements like Academics for Palestine or the Movement for a Free Academia. I usually work in activist circles sort of at the intersection of social and ecological struggles and academic environments because my job is as an academic. I'm a scientist, biologist. I work at the University of Copenhagen. My background is in ecology and evolution, but increasingly through degrowth, I've become more able to enmesh my sort of activist identity and my academic identity. And I'm involved now in a degrowth network at the University of Copenhagen, and we teach a degrowth course together with Rebecca, who's in the audience, where we introduce some of these concepts to students in the university.
Nice, thank you. So maybe we can start with a bit of just introduction of some of the key terms in the degrowth discussion around strategy. So, and then we will be connecting it to the to climate activism and beyond. So basically, I have been involved in the book called Degrowth and Strategy: How to Bring About Social Ecological Transformation. do you know about the book? Have many people come? Maybe raise your hand if you know this book. Okay, that's nice. So kind of about half of the people, or maybe a bit less. And I think it's always very nice to see that there are quite a few people who don't know about the book, because then you can introduce it to new people. So
it's in the library at the back.
It's there in the library at the back, and it's also available in open access. So we're very happy that it was published this way. So you can find it online quite easily. So basically, it was a group of editors, 8 of us, who were involved in this book, and many authors who contributed to it. And together we have tried to think about strategy in relation to degrowth. So the chapter that I wrote for the book, it engages with the analytical vocabulary of Eric Olin Wright, which has been maybe a key way in degrowth to kind of discuss strategic directions. And this vocabulary has 3 key modes of transformation. So the interstitial transformation, which is about creating change from the bottom up by a lot of these interstitial alternatives that exist on the margins of the capitalist system. So, and a lot of degrowth, kind of examples of degrowth that we would often give, they are located in this mode of transformation. So some kind of bottom-up initiatives doing things differently. I don't know, agroecological farmers, so some kind of networks of resistance, some maker spaces, and so on. So, but then in degrowth, there is the acknowledgement that even if this is a very important way to bring alternatives, and many of these alternatives already exist, they kind of hit the wall when it comes to the existing institutions of society, because basically a lot of the policies, laws, and so on, they really are framed with growth and capitalist-centric thinking and imperialist, and you name it. So then it's really hard to make systems change from the bottom up without changing the institutions of society. So, and this is where another mode of transformation comes in. So it's called the symbiotic mode of transformation, which is about changing institutions, basically, that we are surrounded by, and perhaps pushing them from the bottom up to bring about that change. So then, and the third mode of transformation is called ruptural transformation. So, and for Eric Olin Wright, it was the kind of mode of transformation which is about sharp change to the existing system. So really, for example, taking over the state power in a particular context. So the kind of examples of big revolutions would be something that he had in mind when theorizing this. But also, I have been rethinking ruptural transformations in a way that is more smaller kind of scale or temporal. So for example, an occupation of a factory, and I'm sure Salvatore yesterday brought up the example of JKN in Italy. So that would be for me a ruptural mode of transformation. So kind of making a sharp change with the existing system, but in a particular space. Or blocking a coal mine if disturbs the rhythms of extractive capitalism. And for me, it also works in the kind of ruptural logic of transformation, even if it has a particular temporality. So it is blocked, unfortunately, often for a short period of time for the duration of the action, and not on a permanent basis as what it should be. But it kind of pushes for transformation in a more daring, let's say, way. And in the growth discussions, there has often been this emphasis on the combination of interstitial and symbiotic modes of transformation, but I, and also with others, or some of the authors in the book, we emphasize that we should pay attention to ruptural modes of transformation, we should visibilize them, and we should look at the more kind of daring practices that we can also call connected to degrowth. And I think that's where your experience also very nicely comes in, because for me, that connects to what Scientist Rebellion is doing. But maybe my question is, do you think ruptural transformation resonates with Scientist Rebellion, and how?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of what Scientist Rebellion does is about sort of breaking with existing conventions, with existing structures, with existing legal structures, but also cultural structures. So essentially, our movement is academics and scientists that are engaging in civil disobedience, direct action, civil resistance, to call attention to the climate emergency, the ecological emergency, and again, and sort of bring words of Salvatore from yesterday, sort of building a counter-hegemony that is sort of in direct opposition to discourses that we hear a lot from governments and corporations about, we are all in a green transition, sort of highlighting that that's not the case, and what sort of breaking with existing structures of power would look like. I would say the movement here in Denmark is fairly new. I think it started 3-4 years ago. It emerged from Extinction Rebellion that I know a lot of people in the audience are part of, and it was. Yeah, it was an interesting journey for me to sort of become a part of a movement that was sort of saying, like, actually scientists should be doing something very different from what we're expected to do in terms of like delivering information and sort of policy recommendations, but actually breaking with that and say, scientists should be occupying buildings, occupying streets, blocking roads, doing things that will lead them to get arrested, that will put them in positions of vulnerability, and that there was a strategy behind that. There was the reason why that needed to happen, and now it's quite a big movement. I think it's represented in like 30 countries around the world. It often collaborates with other movements that are also engaged in ruptural transformation, including Extinction Rebellion or Last Generation, yeah, I think it's very much a ruptural movement. That doesn't mean that we don't sort of connect with other modes of transformation. Often through our ruptures we create new things, but yeah, it is very much a ruptural.
Could you give maybe an example of an action so that Scientist Rebellion has been engaged in, and kind of the maybe the ruptural elements in that?
Yeah. So actually, our first action in Denmark was giving a class. We talked to a group of students with the catch that the class was in the middle of the street in front of the climate ministry of Copenhagen. This was back in 2021. At that point, I hadn't been involved with Extinction Rebellion for a while, but never really sort of breaking the law. I was kind of like hovering around the movement, helping with outreach, with social media, sometimes giving talks. But I was never really daring to sort of be one of the ones doing the more daring things. And I think that sort of the hovering helped me to understand what the movement was about. So if anybody here has not been involved in any movement, I would recommend maybe hovering around movements before, because it sort of puts you in contact with the people that are doing really transformational change and teaches you a lot. So anyway, so in 2021, this was around the start of the COVID pandemic. It was right after the Danish government had passed the climate law, the Klima law, and Dan Jorgensen at that time had sort of proposed this like hockey stick model of like doing nothing for a long time, and maybe towards the end we'll do a lot. And a lot of scientists were angry at this. We were having conversations together with various scientists and activists about what to do about this. I think Laura, who was here yesterday, had this idea of, well, we should be giving if they're not going to listen to the scientists at the ministry, we should bring the science to them. So we should give a class at the ministry. And in some sense, it wasn't really about sort of talking to the ministry, but sort of signaling to society that something was off between what scientists were saying and what the government was doing, sort of like rupturing that connection, that implicit connection that exists between science and policy making. And so we held a teach-in, which is a very old tradition of ruptural protest. It dates back to the 60s and 70s. Examples of teach-ins were very abundant in the civil rights era in the States and the student movements in France, for example. And the idea was we invited, I think it was 10 lecturers who were giving a class while we set up a bunch of chairs on the street. We had people from Extinction Rebellion and Scientist Rebellion sort of blocking the roads on the two sides of the street. A lot of people here, I can see like Analia and Tim, were very much involved in this. And it was honestly amazing. I think it attracted the attention of every media outlet in Denmark, because it sort of displaced what scientists were supposed to do, and so that confused the media a lot. And so it brought a lot of attention to us. It displaced the classroom to a place where it wasn't supposed to be, and so it signaled something was off. And it was also just a really nice, I mean, it created something. I think it had an aspect of interstitial transformation as well, because it created a new way of delivering the science of climate breakdown here in Denmark. I remember it was like a very beautiful experience. It's like for a second, like you didn't hear the sound of cars in one of the busiest roads in the middle of Copenhagen, and instead you just had like a lecture being delivered. There were many different speakers. I think Rebecca was one of them. There were several people here in the audience that were giving these lectures on many different aspects of the climate emergency. And yeah, it really broke with what scientists were supposed to do. And since then, that's sort of what was expanded the movement and got a lot more scientists to sort of come in and become part of the movement.
Thank you. So I'm very interested in kind of also not only visibilizing the ruptural transformations, but thinking kind of what makes them successful somehow, or what can make them successful. So here it seems that there was an element of surprise somehow to this action.
Yeah.
So and that it was something going out of maybe the climate activism that was more visible on the streets before.
Yeah, so I mean, so there was one of the organizers, or I shouldn't say organizers. Don't say there's organizers to these things. But I think one of the participants of this teaching actually was he couldn't make it to the teaching because he was abroad at the time. But he ended up writing a thesis about the teaching itself, and he highlighted how it's there's this displacement of the classroom that generates the sort of the surprise and the confusion, and it's sort of it's sort of like it moves what we're supposed to be doing as academics to a very different environment. It also surprised the ministry. I think I remember the climate minister was getting calls from the media about like why he had a bunch of scientists risking arrest right below him, given that like a few weeks ago he had said he was acting on the science. So he had to sort of explain himself to the media, and I think this highlights the value of a lot of institutions, and not just academia, but a lot of institutions sort of are implicitly assumed to work together with policymaking, and the importance of sort of breaking that relationship whenever possible to put politicians in positions of discomfort. And in that case, it was in particular the liaison between academia and policymaking, but there are many other ways in which that can be done as well.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm also wondering, so how was it received by the police, that action?
Yeah, so that first action, actually, I remember we had a police contact, and at some point, the police told us either you move or we move you. And so they were extremely surprised because we were also wearing lab coats. Again, maybe there's like an element of theatricality to it. So like, why were these people blocking the road wearing lab coats while delivering a lecture? But actually, after some calls with their central headquarters, they realized it would look super bad to have police moving teachers and their students off the road. And so they actually let us block that street for 3 hours, even though we had not announced the blockade would happen. It was like completely impromptu from the perspective of the police, but they let us they let us carry it out for the 3 full duration, the 3 hours of the teaching. Afterwards, though, we've blocked that same road before, and I think now, because there's not so much of an element of surprise about what we do when we're wearing the lab coat, even when we block the same road, we've broken the same law there several times, and we've gotten arrested for doing that. So I think as the police sort of learns about what we do, we also have to sort of creatively change the things that we do to respond to that. But for that particular teaching, there were actually no arrests. We were breaking the law for 3 hours, but we actually managed to finish the teaching, and it was a very beautiful teaching. It was a very beautiful academic event. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, so now you have kind of positioned the actions of SR in connection to the ruptural mode of transformation, but also you yourself said that, okay, in that action there were elements, there was a combination of ruptural and interstitial, and also I think in the Degrowth and Strategy book we emphasize that, okay, there are different, so all these modes of transformation can be mobilized within degrowth, and then strategies, they are context specifics and dynamic. So it's not that you can say that, okay, this is the perfect recipe for kind of pushing for socio-ecological transformation or for degrowth. So it's really, you have to look at particular context and what makes sense where, and also often it's really a combination of strategies that work together, that also with certain things working at different times, and a continuity and maybe transformations within this, let's say, approaches themselves. So maybe does that resonate with also your experience in Scientist Rebellion and beyond? And would you have some examples where kind of a combination of strategies is mobilized?
Yeah, I mean, I usually for almost any action there is some combination of strategies, because even I mean even the things that are extremely ruptural in some sense involve some form of dialogue with maybe the people that you're sort of disturbing, or maybe at some point the police, to try to negotiate what could happen or what couldn't happen. The big example that to me comes to my mind when I think of sort of like combination of strategies is not so much something related to the Scientist Rebellion, but something that happened right where I work, like below my office building. So I work at the University of Copenhagen. My institution of employment, as of now, they're complicit in the genocide in Palestine. They haven't enacted an academic boycott with Israeli academic institutions, and as of a few months ago, they were also providing financial support to companies that are complicit in the genocide. And there's a big movement of students and academics that were very uncomfortable with this, for obvious reasons. And so there's a student movement called Students Against the Occupation, in the occupation of Palestine. They're, I think, now the biggest student movement in recent history in Denmark. They set up a camp right below where I work, in a garden in the CSS, which is one of the central campuses of the University of Copenhagen. It's called Rafa Garden. And they did this sort of as an escalation tactic, again bringing back to what Salvatore was talking about yesterday. After I think 2 years of trying to talk to the administration to get them to divest from these companies that were supporting the occupation and the genocide in Palestine. My university's management kept sort of ignoring them. They ignored them for more than 2 years. And they decided at one point, we're going to set up a camp here, and we're not going to move until these demands are met. And this was part of a bigger wave of student encampments that you've probably seen in the news, happening all throughout the US, Europe, and even some parts of East Asia. That was clearly a ruptural moment when that camp happened. I was helping set up the tents there. It was very uncomfortable for the administration to have, I think, over 60, 70 tents in the campus, occupying campus lawn. And it was against the management's wishes. The management had to constantly defend to the media why they had its own students were setting a camp in the university. So it definitely broke. It was a moment of breaking with existing power structures, and I think this was what is most important, what actually helped the camp persist and actually be quite successful, as I'll mention in a second. It wasn't just a ruptural strategy. It was an interstitial strategy as well, because in the camp itself, there was a lot of things happening, a lot of things that we would think of today as are very like degrowth affine. It was a very horizontal camp, so there were no leaders. Everything was sort of decided collectively. There were working groups that dealt with different aspects of the camp. So there was like a communal kitchen, there was a communal library, lots of books there about resistance and about direct action. So people were learning a lot, even as they were sort of risking, perhaps being expelled from their own university. They were holding teach-ins, like our teaching at the ministry. with Palestinian scholars. They were holding teachings with various people that have been involved in the pro-Palestine movement, holding documentary sessions. It was sort of like a university within the university that did not respond to the logics of the university of sort of a vertical line management. It was very much a democratic example of what a university could be, and under a very different form of organization. And I think that was also quite threatening to management, to see something like student life, happening in a very different way than what it is dictated to be. And it was symbiotic as well, because for the demands to be fulfilled, it wasn't just enough to set up a camp. There needed to be some form of communication with the target of the demands. In this case, it was the university management. And so there was a group of students that were tasked with being sort of like the representatives of the camp to management, and they were engaging in dialogue with the university's management to see if these demands would be fulfilled. The management, my university's management was delaying and saying like, yes, maybe we'll do this eventually, or like what you're doing is great, but we're not going to do anything that you demand. And at some point, actually, the group escalated. They ended up occupying or blocking the doors of the rectorate building, and at that point, management cut off negotiations. But that actually helped the movement, because now it signaled that that the students were the ones willing to continue negotiations, but the management did not wish to continue negotiations. So that looked very bad in terms of media attention. And I think 1 week after the management cut off negotiations with the student representatives, the management actually gave in to one of the students' demand, which was the withdrawal of these investments in companies that were complicit with the occupation in Palestine. And they also committed to be a lot more transparent in their investments in the future. They didn't give in to the other demands, but this was a great success. It was like one of the few camps that actually managed to get this particular demand anywhere in the world. And I think, to me, it signaled that it was the combination of these strategies working together, the ruptural, that was sort of giving the negotiators the chips that they needed to say, you have this happening and you need to talk to us while this is happening. But also the interstitial stuff, the things that were being created in that camp, the trainings that were happening in that camp, actually generating new things. And I think from that camp, several camps emerged. There was a camp in the Red Square in the center of Copenhagen that led the city of Copenhagen to divest as well. There was another camp set up in the South Campus. A lot of things emerged from this mini university within the university. And it was really through the combination of strategies that happened.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's inspiring. So, and we can see how the earlier combination of kind of interstitial and symbiotic was not enough to actually create this change and making the university to divest, while the ruptural moment, as you called it, so the occupation, is something that could then foster a different kind of discussion. Of course, it doesn't always happen this way, and you say that, okay, it's one of the not so many examples where actually that can be called a victory or maybe a partial victory, and sometimes these occupations have also come with repressions from the university authorities or the police, which is what we have had at Lund University, just across the bridge. So not too far, but quite different stories, unfortunately.
It's actually happened here too. So, I mean, because some of the demands have not been fulfilled, now the students are demanding a boycott of all ties with Israeli academic institutions complicit in apartheid. And the students ended up escalating, and as a few weeks ago, they occupied the rectorate building, actually. And how the management responded to that was bringing policemen with rifles, with attack dogs. Greta Thunberg was one of the students that was helping the student movement in Copenhagen. She actually got arrested, and so it's and this also generated a media storm for the university, sort of showing that the university is more willing to sort of criminalize its own students than cave in to this demand, which is, in the context of a genocide, it's not a great thing to ask. So the criminalization is happening on both sides of the Öresund. I would say it's concerning.
Yeah. So in that sense, the struggle is continuing, and it can also go into the directions that's are problematic and come with more repression. So, but I think maybe still like taking the positive aspect of this experience and kind of the victory or partial victory that has been achieved. So I think that it is also nice to see that there has been some sort of alliance of different people working on the ground, so around the solidarity with Palestine, but then also people who are part of the climate movement, for example, joining forces. So then maybe for me it brings the question, how do you see the potential of the building alliances of degrowth, climate, and decolonial movements?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just again, taking the concrete example of the camp, there was a lot of help provided by the climate movement, especially in the initial stages of building that camp, in terms of like legal support structures. A lot of climate groups that have been involved in dealing with police were providing trainings to the students about how to respond to police repression, what are the legal support structures that are available. And I think they were also providing material support in terms of like tents and things like that. I think there's sort of on the material basis, there's a lot of synergies that can happen in actions that involve both sort of climate struggles and decolonial struggles. But I guess at a much deeper level, I see climate struggles as inherently decolonial or anti-colonial, right? So when we talk about degrowth, sort of like this reduction in production and consumption in the global north countries, it is a question of justice, right? At the very core of degrowth is the issue of who gets to grow and who doesn't get to grow, or who gets to grow at other people's expense. What are the sort of the sacrifice zones that allow the expansion of the green transition in here in rich countries like Denmark and other countries in Europe. And I think there's something very powerful that can be achieved at making those connections more explicit on both sides of these movements, on both decolonial and climate struggles. I think people can be mobilized a lot more towards thinking about climate as a justice issue. If they think about, for example, like the problem of land dispossession that has led to monocultural agriculture spreading across the world, one of the main drivers of climate change, rooted in dispossession of indigenous people, which is one example of that being the Palestinian occupation, right? And building bridges from the other side, from decolonial movements to climate movement, in terms of how to sort of contextualize what is happening in a global level. And I think degrowth provides a lot of vocabulary, a lot of tools that can sort of help bridge these connections. That being said, I think there's a lot that degrowth can learn from decolonial scholarship and decolonial struggle. I mean, there's a lot I have to still learn about this. And to me, it's kind of a process of awakening to sort of complicities that I'm already meshed in, and sort of how to break those. But I think there's a lot of degrowth scholarship can provide to help with that.
Yeah, so I would say that in the degrowth discussion, so there is a lot of focus that degrowth needs to be also decolonial and needs to be feminist, and that these are not just some kind of pockets, let's say, within degrowth discussion, but the whole kind of thinking around degrowth needs to be shaped through these perspectives. So I would say anti-capitalist, feminist, and decolonial. So, and there have been quite a lot of groups that have been pushing this discussion. I mean, many of you might already know about them. So, for example, there is the group FADA, Feminism and Degrowth Alliance, that has been pushing the kind of feminist perspectives within degrowth. So, and the decolonial thinking is also something that is kind of present. But then also maybe sometimes it's kind of easier to theorize than to do things in practice that were really these perspectives are aligned. And I think that there is a lot of, internal reflection about this within the degrowth movement, but also perhaps in some things we do, sometimes we reproduce the very problems that we are aware of. So maybe I'm interested here to hear about your also experience in Scientist Rebellion. Like, has there been some kind of action or some framings in terms of the narratives that you put forward that you have been questioning over time, thinking more with the decolonial, let's say, or other perspectives?
Yeah, I think there's several, and yeah, I mean, I guess I don't want to speak on behalf of the whole movement, but I'm just going to give my personal perspective about things that I think has changed in the narratives, both at the sort of the national level here in Denmark, but also at the international level in Scientist Rebellion globally. So one of the things that Scientist Rebellion does, which is both a positive and a negative, there's kind of like a tension in this, is sort of using the figure of the scientist to gather media attention, right? To sort of say, like, it's not just anybody who's getting arrested and shoved into the police van, is the scientist or the expert. And that's sort of the reason why we wear these white lab coats. I've never worn a white lab coat in my life. I'm a computational biologist. So like, if I were to wear a lab coat when I go to work, people would laugh at me because they know that I would be a disaster in an actual lab. I work with computers. But I do think the white lab coat signals something about that that the people that are sort of providing or producing the knowledge are also, absolutely terrified about the emergency. That being said, there's several problems with the lab coat. One of them is, as I've been told several times by people from that, for example, from Extinction Rebellion, that don't happen to have a job as academics or scientists, is that often police will treat scientists or academics wearing the lab coat better than people not wearing the lab coat. That has happened less and less over time, but that's, I guess, concerning. The other thing is, in some sense, you're sort of setting yourself as if you're separate from the other activists, and you're sort of setting also scientific knowledge as somehow separate from other kinds of knowledge that are just as important, or even perhaps even more important, for the transformations that we need. I think this is not just something that affects science rebellion, but maybe in general the climate movement, that we tend to put scientists in a pedestal and say, like, we listen to the scientists, listen to what the scientists, listen to what the IPCC report is saying, or the IPBES report are saying. These reports are made by fairly conservative spheres of the scientific world, and they're fairly conservative themselves because they're extremely influenced by policymakers and politicians. They're made in a very dry language, and it's honestly a bore to read an IPCC report. And I think that signals the fact that scientific knowledge, while important, is but one type of knowledge that can help us in our struggles. And so one of the things that I think maybe we've abandoned at this point is that the phrase "listen to the science" or "listen to the scientists." We don't usually use that so much in actions anymore. We used it very prominently in that first teach-in, but I think we're more aware of the problems associated with sort of putting scientists in a pedestal. Even though it gives us some advantages in terms of attracting media attention, it also has problematics. And I think one of the main issues is it invisibilizes other types of knowledge that have been destroyed or absorbed or inferiorized. I think social scientists like to use verbs that end with "I", so I'm going to use inferiorized. I'm not sure if that's actually a real verb, but subjugated by processes of colonialism and imperialism. And one of them is like indigenous forms of knowledge, but even sort of collective forms of knowledge that emerge in social movements. I feel like activists know a lot about how to organize, how to mobilize people, a lot of knowledge that scientists and academics in general are completely unaware of. And they're activists, being there on the road, moving people, it teaches you a lot. And I feel like I've grown both as an activist and a scientist by sort of participating in these movements in ways that I could have never grown by just reading papers about activism. And I think sort of raising those other forms of knowledge, collecting forms of activist knowledge, indigenous knowledge, is a really important task, and something that we all, I think, need to work. I still need to work with, because essentially, I mean, it is not through indigenous systems that we are in systems of knowledge, systems of living, that we are in the present situation. You know, it's like science, technology, they have had strong complicities in sort of creating this massive capitalist, industrialist machinery that is driving us into the abyss. And so even though there is a lot of value in scientific knowledge, it is not, we shouldn't sort of put it in a pedestal about other forms of knowledge that are as important as to give us this socio-ecological transformation that we need to get us out of the capitalist, imperialist, patriarchal hell that we're in right now. So yeah, I think Scientist Rebellion has evolved in that respect, and I think now is a lot more aware and sort of eager to highlight other forms of knowledge and all other forms of struggles as well. I think initially at the global level there was a lot of effort put to like sort of highlight the actions happening in Europe and North America. Now there's a lot of effort to sort of highlight actions by scientists in collaboration with indigenous people in the global South, because of you know, complaints and issues raised by global South peoples themselves. There were struggles in the global South that have been quite successful, that have amassed large amounts of people, put them on the streets, and it was largely through indigenous mobilization. And I think one example that comes to mind is in Panama. I think there was a massive anti-mining protest that led to a landmark anti-mining law. I think it was 2 years ago, and it was sad because Scientist Rebellion was involved in that struggle, but it wasn't. While that struggle was happening, other struggles in Europe and North America were being highlighted on the international level. And that was a massive success for the climate and ecological movement. And it was largely through strong alliances between scientists, indigenous people, students, worker movements. And I think we often miss these amazing successes that are happening in the global South, because we're so focused in sort of global North struggle. So that's another sort of tension that has emerged in the movement.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for sharing this reflection and kind of internal critique of the things that have been, or of some things or some closures within the movement, and how you have been also navigating them. And also nice that you have mentioned IPCC report, because of course it's like a key reference point when climate is discussed, but it's true that it is quite conservative, and degrowth has finally entered there, like in one chapter a little bit, but still it's kind of very almost invisible there, and its presence is very, very marginal, and the whole kind of prognosis there, no? Discussions are based on the integrated assessment models that are pretty much projecting growth as the endless thing. So, which I know that there are some people who are working on changing these models also, and kind of trying to bring in degrowth awareness in there, but good to mention it anyway. So now maybe I would like to turn to the kind of the discussions of strategy, the way, like even more recent. So because the book was published, I think in 2022. So, and basically since then, some other people have been in dialogue and critical dialogue with the book and thinking about strategy. So one recent contribution to that discussion has been by Richard Barnthaler, so who has been kind of engaging with the book and bringing 3 issues where he thinks we should think also more in relation to strategy. So I'm interested, I will mention them now, and I'm interested to hear how they resonate with you and what Scientist Rebellion is doing or maybe is planning to do. So the 3 things he mentions, one is the kind of the necessity somehow of compromise for larger transformations. And the critique is that a lot of degrowth discussions, and including about strategy, we very much emphasize this kind of community and building alliances with like-minded communities, while maybe neglecting the broader kind of society and the different groups that you might not necessarily agree with there. So hence the role of compromise is something that he emphasizes in thinking of strategy. The other one is the kind of thinking more of the material interests of wide groups of people. So paying attention to kind of degrowth thinking and even climate, often being thought of maybe by certain groups, let's say, in society, so often comes with also more privilege, but then somehow to push this discussion, you need to actually appeal to maybe the discussion around needs and to bring in more class interests and so on. So that is the second issue. So this kind of material interests and thinking of them when strategizing. And then the third issue is basically that often Degrowth talks about counter-hegemony, so changing the status quo and changing those in power, but not necessarily of kind of creating hegemony ourselves. So there is a lot about challenging power, but how about taking power? And actually, so he frames it as the role of coercion somehow, and he says that some of these discussions are happening in Degrowth around this, with the emphasizing the role of the state in pushing for transformation. So, but basically he kind of frames that coercion is something that we cannot neglect when thinking of larger scale transformations. So these are this kind of three quite thought-provoking points. I would personally say that I don't agree with all of them, or maybe there is one that that resonates with me more, the material interests. The others I find are more kind of tricky, but I wonder how they speak to you, and maybe is there some inspiration there for the current or future actions of Scientist Rebellion?
Yeah, it's a lot. So starting with the compromise. I think, that one I would say, I would problematize that problematization. I think there's a lot of sort of potential for confluence and sort of for building bridges with other movements, the ones we've mentioned, sort of feminist movements, workers' movements, indigenous movements, anti-colonial movements, and I think there's a lot of work we need to do to build further bridges there. Look for other people that are also really exhausted with the way things are now, and try to find ways in which we can help each other. And I think that happened, for example, in the Palestine government. I think in terms of sort of, I would not say compromise, I would say confluence. And I think there capitalism already gives us a gift, which is, it makes almost everybody exhausted and terrified and angry and anxious. And I think we need to sort of try to build on that sort of general affectivity that is created by the system that is dominant right now, and find other people that are sort of suffering from the other heads of the hydra of the system that we're in right now, which might not just be about climate, it might not just be about one particular issue. But compromise, I would say, if there's compromise to be had in terms of building bridges, absolutely. What I don't agree so much is sort of compromise with people that have a lot more power than we do. I don't think we need to find compromise with fossil CEOs. We need to find compromise with people who have a lot of political and economic power. If anything, we shouldn't try to build bridges with them. I think one thing that I think could happen a bit more in Denmark is that there's too many bridges with people in power, and some of those bridges could be burnt, or could be at least turned into sort of fronts of I wouldn't say attack, but sort of things that wouldn't be called bridges. I think politicians in Denmark and corporate heads in Denmark need to be a lot more terrified of us as a movement, rather than us finding ways to convince them to please stop burning the planet for maybe their grandchildren. I don't think that's how they're gonna be. I don't think that's how we're gonna generate transformation, by like sort of appealing to their common sense. And this is my personal opinion. I know there's differences about this in the climate movement. And maybe I think we need both. We need both people talking nicely to people in positions of power, but what we definitely need is people helping to make people in positions of power terrified. And in terms of the balance between those things, I think in Denmark there's a lot of the first thing, but very little of the second thing. And I think we need to maybe make a little bit more of the second thing. And that doesn't mean not doing the first thing at all, but putting a lot more effort into the second thing. The material, I think sort of the material target, I completely agree with that. I think sort of finding material targets for our movement, sort of highlighting the material inequality that is generated by capitalist exploitation is super important. Related to this, our ongoing campaign with Scientist Rebellion in collaboration with Extinction Rebellion is something very material, which is private jets. You've probably seen the papers that are in your chairs. We have this monthly campaign where we visit different airports. It's often the Copenhagen airport, but it's not always the Copenhagen airport, demanding an end to private jets. In Denmark, I think it's over 4,000 private jets that are jointly allowed to land by Copenhagen airport and Roskilde airport every year. Private jets are sort of the pinnacle of not just climate injustice, but social injustice, economic injustice. It's very easy to convince your colleague, the person that's working next to you, that private jets are a bad thing. I don't think anybody in this room would say there's a benefit to having private jets. And I think it's a really good way to mobilize people towards struggle, looking at these sort of obscene toys of the ultra rich that are contributing to climate breakdown. And I think the private jet campaign is one way to go about this. Targeting yachts is another way of going about this. Our campaign we're basically going every month. There's sort of a fun element to our actions. So depending on the month, we might bring a Santa Claus who gets arrested, or a sort of St. Valentine's that gets arrested, depending on what celebration we're having. So we're blocking roads. Sometimes we're doing fun things inside the airport until we get kicked out. And there's room for everybody. There's people taking very high risk actions inside the airport, getting arrested. But there's also very low risk things that you can do, like taking pictures or helping to amplify our message in social media, providing support to the actions that we do. I think our next one is going to be Halloween themed. So there might be, I hear there might be vampires in the airport coming, signaling maybe the vampires of capital, fossil capital. And I think maybe this is why I like sort of bringing up the element of conviviality even to protest themselves. So like making protests fun is a way to attract people. But focusing them on this very material object, I think is a good way to go. And the third one, which was about sort of taking power. I don't know if I have strong opinions about this. One thing I would say is maybe in the terms of building counter-hegemony or infiltrating the hegemony. And again, building up on the things that were discussed yesterday, one thing that we need to be doing is building a broader and stronger cultural consensus, and I think here a lot of people can help out, around undoing things. So we often talk about stopping new developments, like stopping the expansion of the airport, stopping new oil fields that are going to appear in Denmark. But we also need to undo a lot of existing things, dismantle them, disassemble them, destroy them. And undoing things is really important as well. There's a concept called exnovation, which is basically like finding ways to end things. In the context of the degrowth, it's about ending unsustainable structures, ending fossil infrastructure, and I think we need to be making these discourses a lot more accepted in the public imaginary, because I think sabotaging a private jet can be very costly to a person. I I hope eventually there is some form of sabotage to private jets. So it's actually terrifying to get on a private jet because maybe you won't be able to land if you get on the private jet. But in order to make that possible, I think in order to make it easier for undoing to happen by anybody who's willing to do it, there needs to be a much broader cultural consensus about the benefits of the undoing, about the importance of undoing things. And you can call it legal undoing or illegal undoing, it doesn't matter, but ending things is important. And I think we need to be working towards amplifying discourses around ending things in any kind of environment that we find ourselves in, including in academic environments.
Thank you. So kind of following your line of thinking, it seems to me that, okay, we can probably think about coercion as a strategic direction for degrowth, but it is coercion of the rich and powerful. So, and it's a kind of undoing things and targeting by bringing or building a broader coalition with those who have similar material interests and against those who basically are benefiting from a lot of the resources and extra kind of consumption and so on. So it's really kind of coercion of those in power somehow and the ultra rich. So. Okay, maybe I have one final question, so kind of an open one, and then we would also have some time to open the floor for discussion. So we have kind of focused so far around the key concepts around the discussion of degrowth and strategy. So, but now not thinking of those ones, like are there some, I don't know, concepts, books, ideas that inspire your thinking about strategizing in scientist rebellion and beyond, in the present and in the future?
Definitely. I mean, your book was very very instructive for a lot of reasons. A lot of the books that are in the library, I highly recommend to read. The Death of Nature by Caroline Merchant, the Schmelzer book about like all these different ways of doing degrowth. One that I've read recently, sort of going back to the topic of everybody here being exhausted of capitalism and capital exploitation and the way things are now. There's a really, really good book that I recommend everybody to read that's called The Exhausted of the Earth. That's sort of a synthesis of climate justice with decolonial justice, or it's a play on words on The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, and it's a really good book. Has a lot of interesting ideas about how the degrowth and climate movements can sort of evolve forwards. And one of them that really helped my thinking is towards the end. He talks about the temporalities of climate breakdown and climate justice, and this also goes back to maybe changes in discourses, like sort of things that if I were to go back 5 years ago, I would do things differently in terms of how we're narrating particular struggles. We often in climate justice movements we talk about the future, right? So like we're talking about our children and our grandchildren, and I think there is value to that. There's value in thinking about future generations. It's something that indigenous groups do a lot. Thinking about the seventh generation, what will come after we're dead. At the same time, I think there is a lot of value in thinking about the present and the past, and thinking about thinking about climate change is not something that we should talk about. Like we need to curb emissions in 10 years so that this happens, because often when we talk about future, in some sense we are implicitly allowing present structures to maybe perpetuate themselves a little bit longer, right? So we're saying we're willing to sacrifice maybe the next year or maybe the next year because in this 10-year plan, kind of like the hockey stick model of the climate minister from a few years ago. But climate breakdown and all the problems associated with Western imperialism, with capitalism, it's happening and it's killing people in the here and now. It's sort of like an accumulation of wretchedness that has come up to this very point, this very hour, and that's what needs to stop. And I'm thinking, if I were to talk to a father in Gaza holding the corpse of his kid and tell him, listen to the scientists, or like, let's think about the future, that doesn't have any meaning to this person, right? Like, their world has already ended, and the world of a lot of people has already ended because of these structures. And so my thinking is to maybe emphasize the present and the past a bit more than the future when we're mobilizing people, when we're talking about climate and ecological breakdown, when we're talking about societal breakdown. In some sense, the hell is now, but that means the heaven can start today as well, right? And it's starting, right? There's pockets of sort of embodied degrowth happening all over the world right now, like this very festival, and they're in the present, right? They're being created as we speak. They're here. We just need to nourish them and amplify them and be part of them. But I don't think it's that necessary to think about 10, 100 years from now. We should really focus on the present. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So in a way, the hell is now, but it is not evenly distributed.
And that's it's not the same. It's not the same lifeboat for everybody, right?
Yeah.
It's like some people have an armed luxury lifeboat, and other people are barely making it. So yeah.
And there are alternatives already which have to be amplified now. Okay, so I think that we can close our part of the conversation here. And the way I understand it, we should have about 20 minutes, 15 minutes for questions. Sina, could you, how are we doing time-wise? Do we have 15 minutes or so for?
I think, is it working? Yeah. We have 15 minutes and then a short break, and then we have this question session for those who want to have open question session about degrowth or whatever you have been thinking during the 2 days. We have people here who are willing to use their experience and try to answer. So we start with this, and then 15 minutes, yeah?
Yeah, perfect. So, and we're happy to collect also some kind of a round of questions and comments from you, and so that we hear maybe from several people.
Yeah, whenever I hear from Santos Rebellion and other people doing direct action, I always find it hard to actually meet people at their living realities. Like, either they're going to work or mobilizing them to an action while they're like working a very long time. And my question is basically, you can find this statement and like say that their living reality is being questioned by the climate crisis and by climate breakdown. It's true, but I think it's hard to actually get them to join a movement where everybody is in deep way more than they are right now, in terms of how frightened we might be or not. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe let's collect a couple of questions. Sure. Or do you want to, if you want a clarification or
no,
something?
yeah, maybe just a clarification. So you mean in terms of like it's hard for people to feel the sense of urgency that people. Yeah. Okay.
And how to like meet them at their living realities.
Got it.
Yes, so I think there was a question here. Yeah, and there was another one here. Yes. So you, and then you will be next.
Hello? Is it on? Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for a really, really interesting discussion. I wanted to ask a question about, and this might sound odd, but I'll clarify, tactics of terror inside institutions. I really liked your thought process that you articulated about, against can really understand how tactics for making people terrified, or at least like enforcing consciousness, can be done outside of institutions, very much so because you have solidarity and you have potentially like public and free space to do it. Every day at work, I sit across from people who believe that carbon capture, usage, and storage is like the pinnacle of sustainable development. And on a good day, I think I have emotional capacity for debate. On a bad day, I turn into a bit of a bully. And I'm just curious about if you find yourself in an institution like that, and I can imagine universities are no different, like it seems a shame to not take up those opportunities to at least give some form of resistance, but also you sit across from people that once feeling threatened, or dare I say even irrelevant, they completely shut down. So maybe the question that I'm asking is like, what are some tactics for enforcing a little bit of terror, but inside institutions on maybe a more daily practice, if there are any?
Thank you. You had a question, yeah?
Alright, so I really, what you said about not putting academics on a pedestal and really enforcing the importance of activism and different types of knowledge really resonated with me. But I'm wondering about how we can balance this goal and like this way of valuing all sorts of knowledge in our movements, but also fighting dis and misinformation, because one of the big issues, and kind of challenge this issue that we're seeing of systems of dis and misinformation, and one of the ways it's often used to fight that is like falling back on scientific knowledge. Is that maybe, do you think that's maybe the reliance on scientific knowledge to kind of counter it? Is that an issue?
Thanks. So I see more hands. Maybe we go for this round, and then we. So I remember who wants to ask more.
Yes. Maybe I'll take them in reverse order, if that's okay. But completely agree with the systems of disinformation. I think, I mean, like I said, I wouldn't put science on a pedestal. That doesn't mean that there's utility to science and scientific discourses. And the one you gave is a great example of that, sort of fighting disinformation with scientific facts or scientific discourses. I think it depends on the type of narrative that you're weaving, and the ones you might be struggling with. In terms of outright climate denialism, I would obviously sort of bring scientific evidence to the table. That being said, the way I would bring it would be perhaps bringing it together with my emotions, or bringing it in combination with reflections and perspectives from people that are not scientists, so that it's not just like the cold, hard science that is being delivered to a person that doesn't believe in climate change, but it's a combination of different things, including scientific knowledge. In the context of Denmark, I don't think climate denialism is so much of an issue. It's sort of more tactics of delay that are often sort of founded on scientific technologies and scientific narratives. And I think the example of carbon capture and storage is like the perfect example of like scientific discourses being used as a way to delay action. And I think that is one of the reasons why it's important that it's not just about only listening to the scientists. Because honestly, a lot of natural scientists today, largely due to siloing of their own discipline, the way academia is structured right now, are completely unaware of social alternatives to organizing our societies, including degrowth, circular economy, all these different alternatives. And I think maybe there's some humility to be had here. I'm also speaking about myself, that I think natural scientists, including myself, should be a lot more humble to other discourses that are outside, other types of knowledge and information being produced outside of their realm. And that can be social scientists, can be the humanities, and it can be indigenous scholars, indigenous people, movements. I think to come, I completely empathize with what you were saying. How do you talk to somebody that is entirely convinced that BECS is gonna solve climate change? And you can give them the facts, but I think at some point it's also maybe a sort of there has to be some emotional narrative weaved in there as well, talking about like the people that today are suffering from climate change, that are suffering from pollution from fossil companies, the same companies that are now saying that they're going to capture carbon from the sky, even though they continue to invest every year on. So like sort of having them think about what are the agents that they're choosing to ally themselves through these scientific discourses. Like in the case of Denmark, for example, Total is funding a lot of these carbon capture and storage centers, even as they increase their oil and gas extraction activities. Talk to them about the destruction of the Niger River Delta, all the things that Total is also doing in addition to funding CCS in Denmark. And maybe invite them to an action and have them, like, again, bringing back to some of the discussions with Bas and Laura, sometimes it's not about convincing a person, sometimes it's just about inviting them to a space where they might see other people that they are not really exposed to in an academic environment. That was sort of my experience. It wasn't like a lot of my acquired openness to ideas outside of my narrow field of expertise came through interactions with activists. It didn't come from like just a book that told me, you need to start listening to indigenous scholars, you need to start listening to social scientists. Yeah, it was experiential knowledge that happened over time, and so maybe invite them to a mobilization or an action. I don't think you're going to convince them on a one conversation. They're going to start saying, actually, I shouldn't be spending my time on this. But yeah, I completely agree. And maybe that sort of goes also to your question, that it's about figuring out what they can do within the movement, what things they would feel comfortable with. And again, going to the example of me sort of hovering in XR for a while before I actually broke the law, it was sort of about me finding sort of what are the things that my capacities for contributing to the movement, and what were the things that I was comfortable with. And that sort of threshold changed as I became more and more involved in the movement, as eventually I became part of Scientist Rebellion as well. But obviously different people have different levels of comfort and different capacities and different ways in which they contribute to the movements. But honestly, we need everybody, and everybody, I'm sure, has something to contribute to these movements. We need the arts, we need technical knowledge, we need scientific knowledge, we need all kinds of knowledge. We need a lot of different contributions. And maybe the way of meeting them is thinking about like how the crisis, the emergency relates to them, finding about what they think about the sort of asking questions rather than providing answers or trying to push them somewhere. And maybe there we can find a way to sort of find connections and mobilize people.
Yes, thanks, Fernando. So we have 2 questions and maybe a space for a third. So yes, you start.
Yeah, thank you for acknowledging different ways of knowing and understanding things. I would say that I recommend the work of Fernando Racimo, who is hosting the Nordic Animism YouTube channel and doing a lot of work on bringing back and making available the traditional knowledge of Northern Europe, and he does that in amazing cooperation with scholars and practitioners around the world. So that's a recommendation. I would say what in my experience, what this traditional or indigenous knowledge provides is relational knowledge. It's not about knowing how things work and where they are. That's part of it, but it's how you relate to it. And that provides the possibility of living a different life where we are not separate, where we relate to other beings and creatures and life forms and places in a different way. And by doing this, relating, then we allow ourselves to care and be moved by the consequences of things happening to other people and creatures. And through this care, we can manifest the will to defend or the will to restore. And I think it's very important to make these connections, that it's not something only abstract. Oh, I care about Mother Earth, or I care about the rainforest. You have to care about also the environment that you are in. Like me, I live in the countryside. I'm surrounded by these fields with food for animals, and it's like that destruction, that disaster is right there, and it breaks my heart every day. So that gives me something right here locally that I care about, that I can fight for. So that's not really a question. I would like to question, like you had this example of the students occupying the directorate, and then the police respond, like with armed forces. And I just want to say that from my background as a climate environment activist, and the training I had, and the actions I've done with Scientist Rebellion, with Extinction Rebellion, with other groups, one thing that is different from the actions I have participated in the Palestine movement, in front of Terma and Lystrup and other places, that never, ever in a climate action have I seen activist protesters flipping the finger at the police, calling them violent psychopaths, or shaming random people or workers. Never, ever have I seen that. But I have seen that from the youth protesters in the Palestine movement. And I have theories about why this happened. And I won't go into that, but I think it's very important to investigate and look at, when we talk about tactics and strategy, how do we express ourselves? Because I think that this particular thing is what is keeping a lot of people away from joining, and it also looks really bad in the press. Do you have any thoughts about this? I mean, what is the kind of training we need, or things that we have to agree on?
Yeah, so maybe hold on, one more question, and then you address both, and we have to close in 3 minutes.
Okay.
So,
okay, that's
yes.
a lot.
My question is maybe also a bit more clarifying, because when you talk about indigenous people of the global south, that is of course not a homogeneous like group or whatever, and I was just wondering what are the, I mean, answer that a little bit, what are the defining points that separate it from what you see as scientific knowledge? Would you like to keep it separate? And I mean, because it's not, there's not the indigenous people, like how to discuss maybe contradicting viewpoints with other indigenous groupings, and what you discuss like see as scientific knowledge, and would you like to integrate it more or keep it more separate?
So that helps me actually to answer this question. So that's great. I'm right now I'm sort of writing a book about Scientist Rebellion and sort of the evolution of Scientist Rebellion, and it's forced me to look into one of the chapters is about how scientists conceive of not scientists activists, just scientists purely, how they conceive of themselves, and one of the sort of prevailing narratives is that scientists are supposed to be detached and objective, and sort of treat the sort of object of study as something separate from them and not assign value or emotions to it. It's actually, in the history of science, it's a fairly recent concept. It really, the concept of scientific objectivity emerged in the late 19th century. I think when you talk to scientist activists, you interview scientist activists, they don't use these things, right? They weave in narratives relating to like how much they care about their study system, how much they care about the earth that they're studying, how much they care about the ecologies that surround them and that they observe every day. And that to me sounds a lot more like the relational kind of thinking that is sort of standard in many indigenous groups, right? So I think in some sense scientists, activists are realizing that these relational forms of knowledge are sort of the way in which, or the sort of the motivator for doing things like interrupting a conference to talk about the climate crisis, or occupying a government building or a corporate building. It's sort of the relation that they have with the thing that they observe every day that pushes them into action, and that this even the notion that any scientist can be like completely neutral and objective is sort of in some sense ridiculous, right? Like everybody assigns some value to whatever they're studying. Like I am fascinated by the things that I'm studying, or I'm scared by the things that I'm studying, but I would be crazy for me to say that I'm like completely neutral with respect to the thing that I'm studying, and also with the thing that is pushing me to act. So I think there's a lot of this relational knowledge that is re-emerging, and we should sort of amplify it a lot more. And obviously there's different ontologies that different indigenous groups have, but here maybe it's about sort of like creating, I think this is the Zapatista motto, right? Creating a world where many worlds can flourish rather than one single world that is determined by sort of the science technical language that determines that that humans are separate from the natural world, which in turn is separate from the inorganic world. Yeah, and then the thing with the rector, I can't speak for the student movement. I think there's definitely tactical advantages and disadvantages to how you interact with the police. Personally, I think I wouldn't want to like sort of like taunt a police officer. I do think there's a lot of problems with the institution of the police in itself, and whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. I think the way to go here is to ask within that movement why they're taking that particular approach and whether that's actually working for them or not. But it's I don't think it's because I'm not I wasn't in the rector occupation, and I'm not as I wasn't involved in the decision making that led to that particular type of behavior. I think in Scientist Rebellion in general we try not to taunt the police. That said, we also try not to like sort of be friendly to the police because they're a repressive institution that responds to the state. But it is a tactical discussion that I think we should all be having as well. So yeah, it's a good point.
So thanks a lot, everyone. I think that I will very shortly conclude this session by saying that join the decolonial, climate, degrowth movements and engage in those and think about strategy at the same time. And that's what we have been kind of trying to do in this session. So thank you and